I first met Dirk Bogarde merely in the sense that I shook hands with him once. This would be back in the early 50s, when I was, before I went up to Cambridge, I was a member of Dover Film Society, and we had staged a trip to a studio once, and the studio was, at that time, I forget which one it was, one of the smaller ones. But the film we went to see shooting was Dance Little Lady, a version of the Compton Mackenzie novel with Mai Zetterling in it. And there was another film shooting in the same studio, which was The Sleeping Tiger, which was supposedly being directed by somebody called Victor Hanbury. But I recognized that, in fact, it was being directed by Joe Losey, who at that time was blacklisted, so he had to do it under an assumed name. And the stars of that were Dirk Bogarde and Alexis Smith. And we just visited the set, that's where I saw and recognized Losey, and met Dirk Bogarde sufficiently to shake hands with him and no more, and so on. But I first really got to know him. It was always somehow, at the beginning anyway, in association with Losey, because my friend David Robinson once was writing a thing about Losey and was given access to his papers. And in that he found that Losey's instructions to his PR people for one of the later films were that they could deal with everybody except Dilys Powell, who was then film critic of the Sunday Times, and me, and he would deal with us personally, because we were especially important, obviously, and so on. So, as a result, when I got to know Losey, which was for the first time when I visited it was a location rather than a set, for The Servant, which was a house in Chelsea, and I spent some time there, and so I met Dirk Bogarde and James Fox, as well as Joe Losey, and and I got to know we got on very well, and so I think probably most of my subsequent meetings with Dirk for the next few years were always with Joe Losey films. I remember with King and Country, for instance, I met Dirk, saw something of Dirk, and I think we had lunch in the studio with him and Tom Courtenay, and particularly Accident, which was again was being shot the days I was there on location somewhere in Oxford, and I got to talk to everybody, and it was, especially since it was written by Pinter, who of course I knew quite well, and directed by Joe Losey, whom by that time I knew very well, and I'd got to know Dirk pretty well, so it was interesting talking to him. And but I guess the climax of my relationship with Dirk was I read and subsequently got to know the author. I read a number of books by Jocelyn Brooke, whose most famous books then were what were called the Goose Cathedral Trilogy, which was sort of fictionalized autobiography. And there was a fourth book called The Dog at Clamper Crown, which was the same sort of form. But as well as that, because I like these very much, and So I sought out, as tends to be my wont with literature, everything else I could find by him, and I came across this novel called Image of a Drawn Sword, which is a very strange story. It's, I guess, sort of science fiction. It takes place in some unspecified, slightly future period, and it's about this very impressionable young man who meets this soldier, I think probably an ex-regular army man, an officer, who is clearly very charismatic and is setting up a sort of private army. And the impressionable young man is drawn into this, and things gradually get weirder and weirder, and there's definitely a strong gay undertone, because Jocelyn was gay, in fact, and is fairly evident from all his books. And I thought, well, this would be a wonderful way to get together Dirk Bogarde playing the officer, and maybe James Fox or maybe Michael York playing the young man, or so I suggested this to Dirk and gave him the book, and he read it and was very enthusiastic about it, but said, weirdly, I thought, that he thought he was too old to play the officer, but he would love to direct it. He'd always wanted to direct a film, and he thought this would be the perfect subject. And maybe you could cast, who did he suggest? I forget who he suggested to play the officer, the role that I thought would suit him. But and the young man could be David Warner, and and he was really serious about this. So we discussed how it would be scripted and all the rest of it, on the basis that it was a production that Dirk would direct. It would be his direct. In fact, he never did get to direct a film, but this would have been his debut as a director. And finally it came to nothing, because after a while I had got to know Jocelyn Brooke quite well, because he lived not far from where I had my country residence down in Kent. And so I and my then partner Brian visited Jocelyn quite a lot, and he was quite interested in this idea. But then, unfortunately, he died, and the problem was that all his books were then out of print. He was clearly very unfashionable at the time, and so the estate were quite pleased with that, because, I mean, apparently none of them was worth anything in terms of establishing probate. And if one of them was suddenly being sought for the film rights, that would change things and make the estate much more difficult. So for the moment, that went into abeyance, and then shortly after that, I went off to teach in America, and that was the end of that thing. But funnily enough, my relationship with Dirk sort of continued in a remote sort of way. And when I came back in '78 to be the art critic of the Times, my editor thought, well, before I started on that, it would be amusing if I did 1 week of film criticism, just to remind people. So, and it happened that one of the films that I was reviewing that week was the Fassbinder film with Dirk Bogarde in it, which I liked a lot, and said so. And so I got a postcard from Dirk saying, well, thank God you're back. Now don't go buggering off to America again. But then unfortunately, from that point of view, then the next week appeared in my new guise as the art critic of the Times, and so on. But Dirk and I remained in contact, and which went on right till after. I suppose the next important thing was that at the Cannes Festival, a couple of years later, Dirk was actually president of the jury at the Cannes Festival, and so he invited me to lunch one day, and I had lunch with him and Tony Forward, his partner then, and we had a very agreeable time. And then shortly after this, there was I think it was an article written by Dirk. It may have been an extended interview with him in the Times, in which he went out of his way to say that, of course, there was no hint of homosexuality in his relationship with Tony Forward. Indeed, he said, Tony is rather homophobic. And that was obviously totally untrue. I mean, at this lunch, it was clear, A, that they were lovers, and B, that Tony talked, well, to be frank, like an old queen. No sign of homophobia. So I wondered why Dirk found this necessary to say this, while, he let it become clear that he was gay. That's a totally mystery to me. He always called him Forward, and I felt that their relationship was probably built on a sort of fantasy where he was the officer and Forward was his Batman. So then after Tony died, and he was quite ill too. I think Tony died of a stroke, and I think Dirk, a couple of years after, had a stroke himself, and he said, because he disposed of the place they lived in the south of France, came back and lived in London in a flat just opposite Harrods, actually, and I visited him there a couple of times, just in the way of friendship, as friends do, before he died. But he always remained something of a mystery to me, and I used to tease him because at a certain point, this must have been still back in the 60s, it became fashionable for singers, for actors, stars, who weren't professional singers, weren't even known to be able to sing, to make records. And so people like Tony Perkins made records of pop songs and so on. And Dirk made a record which he spoke the lyrics to famous classic pop songs with the music playing in the background. And I always, of course, I rushed to get the record, and I always found it rather amusing because Dirk clearly had no real musical sense, so he tended to be very crisp and precise. And so sort of, a foggy day in London town had me low, had me down. And I used to tease him about this, because he said, well, there were two things that he never could do. He couldn't sing, and he never learnt to drive a car. And he said, But no one ever believed either of them. And so when all these stars like Tony Perkins, Tab Hunter, Rock Hudson, etc., were making singing records, and so they said, well, you have to do that. And he said, I can't. And that's how they came to the idea of him speaking expressively the lyrics to these things. And the funny thing is, at the same time, Charles Boyer made a similar record of classic French songs where he spoke the lyrics. But clearly he had a strong musical sense, so it really worked very well, him speaking the words with the autumn leaves playing in the background, and so on. So it was, obviously Dirk was perfectly right in that he just didn't have that musical thing. He said the other thing was he never learnt to drive a car, and in one of his films, I think it's Angels Want 5, I think, where he was supposed to drive a Jeep up to a Lancaster, because it takes place during the war. And so there was the last Lancaster existing standing on the tarmac, and he was supposed to drive up to it, and he said, well, I can't. They said, of course you can, anybody can do it. As a result, he drove the car, but drove it into this priceless Lancaster. And so they said, oh, well, maybe you're right, you can't drive. And they had to ditch the scene for some time while the Lancaster was at great expense repaired. And so I think that's most of my Dirk Bogarde stories.